At this point, we begin our discussion of reptiles found in freshwater aquatic systems in the United States. And we begin the reptiles with order Testudines, which are the turtles. And so turtles are certainly an interesting bunch. There's 100 species total found in the U.S., 17 species found in Kentucky. 16 of these are aquatic and so relevant to our particular class. Of course, you all know that the one species of turtle that's not aquatic is the eastern box turtle, of which we have a few specimens there in the lab. They're certainly interesting turtles, and there are other non-aquatic turtles found in other parts of the United States. But interestingly, all those other species in Kentucky are aquatic, and the vast majority of turtle species just in the U.S. are aquatic. And of course, when we say aquatic, we mean that their niche is water associated. They are reptiles. They can live independently of the water, no question about it. But their means of obtaining food and escaping predators are all tied to the water. Now, so turtles have interesting characteristics. They have no teeth, but they have these strong jaws that essentially constitute a beak-like structure. The shell has a hinge between the plastron and the carapace, the lower and upper portions of the shell, to protect the turtle. In most of our aquatic turtles, those two portions of the shell cannot seal all the way up, as can the shell of an eastern box turtle. But our aquatic turtles rely on swimming to be able to escape potential predators. Most of our turtles, aquatic turtles, and I suppose our one terrestrial turtle in the state are carnivores and opportunistic omnivores in some cases. We have 3 examples of the common aquatic turtles that we see in the state found on this slide. On the left-hand side, we have a red-eared slider, which is certainly a common turtle found throughout the southeastern United States and beyond. We have a painted turtle, which is not uncommon, although I don't encounter them frequently in Kentucky. And then we have a map turtle, which is commonly encountered in Kentucky and can be found in many of our local streams, such as Elkhorn Creek. Red-eared sliders tend to be a common pond turtle in central Kentucky, and so oftentimes you'll see red-eared sliders paddling around in ponds or reservoirs. Map turtles, I more often encounter them in streams, although they're found in reservoirs as well. So here we have a list of our Kentucky aquatic turtles, and a discussion of all these is a little bit beyond the scope of our intentions here, but we do want to talk about a couple of significant turtles that are found in aquatic systems in Kentucky. So interestingly, the first turtles appear to have showed up even before the dinosaurs and have undergone relatively little change since that time, similar to the gar that we talked about earlier. And so they can live for more than 50 years, which is an incredibly impressive lifespan for any wild organism. But the average apparently is 35, which is no slouch, certainly in the wild. That's a really long lifespan for an aquatic, or for any organism in the wild for that matter. Some turtles do live considerably longer, though. Those eastern box turtles, for instance, have been documented at over 100 years in age. Turtles do live in almost every type of habitat, although our focus here is are the aquatic turtles. So one of the turtles we wanted to talk about is the spiny softshell turtle. And so we have Alipane spinifera. We have one of these in the lab that I think you all have named Pancake, if I'm not mistaken, or at least some students have. And so they're interesting turtles. That little guy we found like 4 years ago in Hickman Creek. If you haven't picked him up, I'd recommend that you pick him up at some point. When you do, you'll notice that the shell feels a lot like sandpaper, and it's really soft and flexible. So you want to be careful with him. You also want to keep in mind that he has an extremely long neck, and so they're very good at reaching around and biting you. In fact, if you don't grab them from the back of the shell. The nose is somewhat reminiscent of a snorkel, and so with that long neck and that nose, they're able to remain buried in the sediment at the bottom of the stream and reach up and just barely put that nose above the surface to obtain oxygen. They're extremely common in rivers and streams. Apparently they're common in large lakes as well. But here in central Kentucky, very commonly observe them. Nearly any stream here in central Kentucky, you're likely to find soft-shell turtles. Interestingly, they appear to feed really heavily on crayfish. They may eat aquatic insects as well, but most studies indicate that their diet is primarily consists of crayfish. I thought another interesting thing about spiny softshells is their ability to exchange gas through their skin in both water and air. And so this allows them to remain submerged for long periods of time, up to 5 hours in fact. And so they can obtain oxygen across their skin, similar to what you see in the amphibian world. It's not something that's very common at all in reptiles, but it is observed in these spiny softshells. They get quite large, up to 17 inches, which doesn't sound that big, but that's a really large turtle if it's the diameter of the shell is 17 inches. They're quite impressive specimens. The other two turtles we wanted to talk about are the common snappers and the alligator snappers. And so the common snappers are the type of snapping turtle that we have here in central Kentucky. And in fact, if you've seen a snapping turtle in Kentucky, it's almost certainly a common snapper. They're very frequently confused with alligator snappers. We'll talk about how to tell the difference here. Alligator snappers are found in Kentucky, but they're extremely rare, and they're found only in the far western part of the state. So if you've seen an alligator snapping turtle in the wild, it's quite a rare sight and very, very impressive. It's unlikely that I get reports all the time of people that have seen alligator snappers, but they're always common snappers. I will point out there was an alligator snapper that was seen here in central Kentucky maybe 2 years ago that the state herpetologist circulated a picture of. Apparently it was a released specimen there in Woodford County. So it is possible, but it's just very unlikely. All the common snapping turtles are everywhere, extremely common, and most likely those are the snappers you've encountered. So common snappers are really impressive animals, though, and so they have this dark brown shell, often covered with algae. They have a huge head and powerful jaws, and this really long tail with spikes on the tail that are reminiscent, as you can see there, of dinosaurs. They get up to 45 pounds in the wild, which is amazing, and apparently can exceed 75 pounds in captivity. And so they'll eat almost anything that they can get their mouths on. So invertebrates, aquatic plants, fish, birds, small mammals. They love soft, muddy bottoms, plenty of vegetation, and apparently even make their way into brackish water in some cases. The most common lengths are 10 to 18 and a half inches or so. It's April 1st as I make this video, and we're approaching the time in which we'll see snapping turtles crossing the road. I don't know that I've seen any yet this year, but they're going to be crossing the road soon because they're moving around looking for places to lay their eggs. It's unfortunate that females lay their eggs out of the water, and so they're extremely vulnerable to getting hit by cars as they move out of the water and make their way from place to place. So these guys are big, but they're not nearly as big as the alligator snappers. They're certainly impressive animals. So they mate nearly all year round, at least in the months that are reasonably warm, and lay usually 20 to 30, but as many as 80 eggs. The eggs are often laid in a muskrat lodge. Muskrats, of course, dig holes in the sides of creeks and ponds. The muskrats are a mammal similar to a small beaver, perhaps. I don't know. Perhaps that's not true. Very small beaver with a tail that's different and a different niche. So muskrats dig these holes that the snapping turtles utilize. And the eggs incubate for 9 to 18 weeks, and then these little tiny guys come out and spread out all over the place. And so there's a baby, there's an adult, there's a couple babies with a quarter. There is a baby common snapper. Here is a baby common snapper. This is my niece Maddie that she found on Saturday. Today is Wednesday, and she found this on Saturday. About as close to a newly hatched common snapper as I have ever come across. And she's going to keep it for a few days and feed it, and then release it. Or I thought we might, if we come back to school at some reasonable time, we might move it into the lab. Now, the last turtle we're going to do is the alligator snapper, a different genus, and what we notice is that this is the largest freshwater turtle. The record is, believe it or not, 316 pounds. So take a look at this guy in a kid's swimming pool there. I mean, these guys are massive turtles. You probably have seen that skull that we have in the lab of an alligator snapper that, I mean, I think is almost as big as the average size human skull. It's absolutely huge. Alligator snappers are different than common snappers in that they have these three keels, these three ridges found in their back, whereas common snappers have more of a smooth shell. Alligator snappers have a bigger head, if you can believe that, relative to body size. And they actually have, although it's going to be tough if you want to use this as a feature to distinguish them from common snappers, they have a little worm-like structure that they use as a fishing lure. And so they're typically, although this one's not, this is probably a captive turtle, typically covered with algae. And they're a little hard to spot just because they look like these kind of monsters making their way through the aquatic systems. So they open their mouth and they wiggle this little tongue, which looks like a worm. Fish come in to check that out, the mouth closes, and that's their meal. Now they feed in other ways as well. They're opportunistic, certainly, but that's an adaptation that they possess that allows them to fish fairly effectively. Now, alligator snappers, like I said, they're found in Kentucky, but there's not many. Extremely, extremely rare in Kentucky. So they're listed as vulnerable. They're found in East Texas to Georgia and north to the Mississippi River in Iowa, although I imagine they're quite uncommon by the time you get to that point. Found in Kentucky, but not many of them in Kentucky. Here's the distribution in Kentucky. And you can see they've only been found certainly in that one little spot out there close to the Mississippi, which honestly, just looking at this map, I'm not sure exactly where that is, but that's awfully close to the few swamps that we have in the state out there on that edge of the state. So here's some nice pictures of alligator snappers for you. These are big guys, and here is a contrast between a common snapper, if we look at the upper picture, found on the left, and an alligator snapper found on the right. So you can see the ridges on the alligator snapper, the larger head, the more pronounced beak. Here again, we have the contrast between the two. So the ridges, the shell really is different between the alligator snapper found on the right and the common snapper there found on the left. Again, many people will tell you they saw an alligator snapper when it was actually a common snapper. And you can understand if you don't have them side by side, you might be tempted to call it an alligator snapper. But alligator snappers are quite rare. Okay, a couple other turtles. One we have that are common in the state. One is a common map turtle. As I mentioned, they are very commonly found in streams in the state. If you go canoeing on the Elkhorn, you'll find all kinds of common map turtles there. What we notice is that they lack the red ear structure, the reddish bar that we see in the red ear sliders, and they have a bit of a keel along the midline of their shell. You see these little pointed structures that red ear sliders don't have there. They like to bask in the sun. They exhibit this sliding behavior that you see in many of the turtles from this group. So they bask in the sun on a rock or a log. You come along and they slide off into the water before you can get to them. They feed on clams, corbicula heavily, crayfish, snails, insects, some plants. They don't get really very big. 13 inches is a big one, but they are common in different streams in the state. Here we have probably the most common aquatic turtle in the state, I bet. And so this is our red-eared slider. And what we notice is this is easily distinguishable by the red stripe that it has behind its eye. These are carnivorous when they're young, and then interestingly they transition into herbivores as they mature. Just like the map turtles, they tend to bask and slide into the water when they are approached. They're common in both streams and especially ponds in the state. These are what used to be known as dime store turtles back before we kind of developed a conscience and passed laws concerning this. These would be very commonly sold in all sorts of stores to kids. The babies would, and most of those, of course, perished as a result of poor care. But I didn't see that in my lifetime, but my parents talk about observing that when they were young. These guys don't get very big, but are one of the most common, if not the most common turtle that we find in the state. We make our way now to order Squamata, suborder Serpentes, which are the snakes. We have 102 species found in the United States and 32 found in Kentucky, and only 7 of these are semi-aquatic, which is kind of disappointing, I realize. But only 2, and this is even more disappointing, only 2 of these semi-aquatic snakes are found in central Kentucky. So unlike the turtles, interestingly, most snakes are terrestrial, but we will spend a moment talking about our aquatic snakes that we do find actually in central Kentucky and then one from western Kentucky. So these snakes may be found in riparian, marshy, or ephemeral wetlands. Some of the 2 species of aquatic snakes here in central Kentucky, actually both of them are really pretty widespread, as we'll mention here in a moment. Now, as a brief review, it's easy to distinguish between venomous and non-venomous snakes, and it's important in this particular discussion because, in my personal experience, a large percentage of people will tell you that they have been to a local stream, reservoir, or pond, and they have seen a cottonmouth. A cottonmouth, of course, is one of the 3 species of venomous snakes. There are 4 actually total, but one of those, the pygmy rattlesnake, is quite rare. The cottonmouth is one of the 4, let's say, species of venomous snakes that are found in the state, and it is one of our aquatic snakes. Its niche is aquatic, associated with the water. Now, what you'll notice is that if that report comes from central Kentucky, then it's certainly inaccurate. So there's 4 aspects listed on this slide that allow us to distinguish between venomous and non-venomous snakes. One is very simply the pupil shape. As you realize, our venomous snakes in Kentucky, not in the United States, but in Kentucky, are all pit vipers, and so they all have this vertical, so-called cat eye pupil, whereas our non-venomous snakes have a round pupil. All our venomous snakes in the state are, again, pit vipers, and so they all have this broad triangular head with these heat-sensing pits that are found on either side of the head. This is not true for the coral snake, but the coral snake is not found in Kentucky. Another thing we can do to distinguish a venomous snake is look at the color pattern. And so just look at the pattern, for instance, of a rat snake versus a copperhead. Many people will tell you, I saw a copperhead. But when you look at the picture of the snake, I've learned that you should be open-minded at least. But when you look at the picture of the snake, most often it's a rat snake, a milk snake, or some other non-venomous snake. But lastly, one of the easiest things to do is know the range. And so when someone tells you they saw a cottonmouth, you can know, even without asking for a picture or any other details, that if it was in central Kentucky, it was certainly not a cottonmouth. So interestingly, if we look at the range of the cottonmouth, we see it's in far western Kentucky. We, of course, at least if we were in Wilmore, are about right here where the cursor, maybe about right here where the cursor is there. So you don't find cottonmouths for another 100 miles at least until you get into the western part of the state. And even then, they aren't especially common until you make your way a little further west. So cottonmouths are one of the most commonly confused snakes, most misidentified snakes that we find in the state. And this is the snake that people usually think is a cottonmouth. So here we find ourselves at the northern water snake, Nerodia cipodon. And Nerodia cipodon is the subspecies we find right here in central Kentucky. This is a subspecies of the Midland water snake, which is found up into Canada, all the way down to the southern tip of Florida. And so different subspecies found in these different areas, but this snake is found in almost every body of water in Kentucky. I'll go so far as to say it's highly likely you've got one in a little koi pond in front of your house. These guys are really, really common in all sorts of different habitats. So I saw one Saturday. What was that? No, more recently than that. Was it Monday? We were fishing and observed one making its way along the edge of a pond. These guys prefer the water, and they're moving. If you find them out of the water, they're moving from one water source to another. But their niche is certainly aquatic, and so they eat fish, frogs, and vertebrates. Elle kept one as part of her research in the lab for an extended period of time and fed it fathead minnows all winter, in fact, until she recently released it. The color pattern on these guys can be a little bit confusing because, like most snakes, as we see here in the upper right-hand corner, this is a juvenile, so they have very bright colors as a juvenile, and then these fade in the bottom right here. They fade as you move towards adulthood. These are just some other specimens over here. I don't know that these are necessarily found in Kentucky. The colors look a little bit different. This is more commonly observed or more consistent with what we see in Kentucky. Now this is typically the snake people think is a cottonmouth. These are not cottonmouths, but they're not necessarily snakes that make awesome pets. They do tend to be fairly short and fat, which is kind of reminiscent of a cottonmouth body shape. They do tend to be very aggressive. Maybe that's an overstatement. I mean, they'll bite you if you pick them up. Is that being overly aggressive? Probably not. That's pretty reasonable, isn't it? But they're not necessarily super friendly from the first time that you pick them up. And they're quite common. I've observed, it's not uncommon to observe piles of these in Madison County and Tate's Creek. I remember seeing, 2 or 3 per rock as you cross the creek in this location on Tate's Creek in Madison County, not too far upstream from the Kentucky River. They're interesting snakes and certainly very widespread in the state. This is our other aquatic snake here in central Kentucky, the queen snake. And so this is a snake that's commonly associated with smaller streams. It's very common, though, in the state. We see them in Jessamine and Hickman and any little stream you'll go to in the state. These guys feed on crayfish, really preferentially, much more so than northern water snakes. They're two-tone in color. The top is brown. The yellow, the bottom portion of the snake is yellowish. They don't get quite as big as do the northern water snakes. They don't seem to be, in personal experience, quite as aggressive as northern water snakes, but they may be overall. They're certainly interesting snakes, very common, but the second of the 2 aquatic snakes that we have right here in central Kentucky. Now, the other aquatic snakes are found in the western part of the state for reasons I couldn't really outline for you, but there are several other species of aquatic snakes found in the far western portion of the state. Elizabeth Strasco sent a picture of an interesting snake, a copperbelly water snake, that she found in her yard there in Memphis, which I realize is not Kentucky, but that's one of our additional aquatic snakes found in the western portion of the state. So here we have the last aquatic snake that we'll talk about, and this is not one that's found here in central Kentucky, but it's the cottonmouth. And so this is, one of our 4 species of venomous snakes. And I don't have a lot of experience with cottonmouths. I've seen a handful in my life. Most of them, a couple in western Kentucky when we were out there collecting fish, and a couple down in the Everglades. They're really pretty snakes. They tend to be, like most of our snakes, have very bright colors when they're little, and then it fades as they get bigger. They are known for this behavior called gaping, which this particular snake in the lower left-hand corner is doing. And so I've never observed this in person, but when they're threatened, apparently they open up their mouth and tilt their head back in a threatening pose, and the inside of their mouth is white, hence the name cotton mouth. So they feed on fish, frogs, and sometimes other snakes, or allegedly fairly aggressive, although who knows if that's accurate or not. I've seen other reports that seem to indicate that they're not. And they're certainly interesting snakes, but not found here in central Kentucky. You've got to go fairly far west to observe these guys. Lastly, in our reptile category, although unfortunately this is not found in Kentucky, We want to talk briefly about the order Crocodilia, because this is an order that's common in aquatic systems and that we've actually discussed previously in one of our earlier discussions in the class. We have 3 families in this order. The Alligatoridae, which includes 8 species, including our American alligator. The Crocodilidae, which includes 14 species of crocodiles. And the Gavilidae, which interestingly includes 1 or 2 species, depending on which taxonomist you talk to. Certainly the gharial, which is a fish-eating crocodile, is 1 species in this family. And this is a picture of a gharial here. They're interestingly actually up here as well. They have these long, very odd, in my opinion, thin mouths. And then the Tomistoma is perhaps a different species, or perhaps just a subspecies of the gharial itself. Both of these are rare and found in the northern India, Nepal region, but they're the 3rd family in this order. Now, in the United States, we have both the alligator family and the crocodile family, excitingly. So by far most common is Alligator mississippiensis, which is the American alligator. We see the range outlined here on this particular slide. It's really easy to forget, but that range goes all the way up into North Carolina, and it's really not that much further south of where we are. The range also is, they're found in Tennessee, in that edge of Tennessee where Memphis is located there. Again, Elizabeth mentioned they'd seen one in her county, which was 7 feet long, I believe she said, there in Memphis. So, but they're certainly more common as you get into the southern portion of the range. So the males get up to 11. Males are 11 feet average, but up to 15 feet and 1,000 pounds, which is certainly a large animal. Females are a maximum of 8 feet or so, and these guys are so fascinating because they really are dinosaurs. I mean, that's not exactly true, but they were here at the time of the dinosaurs in unchanged form. So they are certainly reminiscent of dinosaurs. Alligators are freshwater only, rarely venturing into brackish water. They mate in May, coming up here before too long. The male roars to attract females, and then he fights with other males to try to defend his territory. The female builds a nest, and a nest is shown here in this picture, and the female's on the nest. She lays 35 to 50 eggs. They're 6 to 8 inches when they hatch, and a large percentage of these are consumed by predators, as you might imagine. The ones that make it have a really extensive lifespan, up to 50 years in the wild. And so these are certainly, in my opinion, one of the most fascinating of our American reptiles. This is just a brief reminder. We looked at this slide when we did our alligator hole discussion. This is a gentleman standing in an alligator hole doing some sort of research. Here's a picture of an alligator hole in the Everglades from above. And here is a graph that shows us the distribution of rain in the Everglades there in South Florida. And so there's very little rain in the January, February month and May. But as we make our way into June, most of the rain falls in June, July, August, and September. So in the dry season, the alligators, as we mentioned, dig out these holes by rolling over and over. And these holes serve as refugia in the Everglades, both for alligators and other organisms that need water during these dry times. Now, a lot of people forget that we have crocodiles in America, native to America as well. So the American crocodile is shown here on the slide, and we see the overall anatomical differences between alligators and crocodiles. And so the crocodiles have a much, as you well know, narrower mouth, whereas the narrower head shape, more pointed, whereas the alligator has this large, blunt head shape. And we also notice that, although I don't know that it's necessarily very obvious here, the crocodile has a more rough back, sort of reminiscent of what we saw in that alligator snapper. It has larger projections sticking up on its back. Here's some better pictures of the head. On the top we have the American crocodile. On the bottom we have the American alligator. So American crocodiles are much more rare than our alligators. There's an estimated 2,000 only in the United States. I don't have a number for you on the alligators, but it would be exponentially greater than that number. So these guys get larger. The males can get up to 20 feet and 2,000 pounds, which is actually amazing. And they average 13 to 16 feet, which is in the upper, which is near the maximum size for an alligator. Females average 12 feet or so. They're almost all south of Miami, but now in the United States, as you can see on our map here. But every now and then they get up a little further north. If you want to see them down there in South Florida, then you need to head towards the water. So in the Everglades, down at Flamingo, or actually Flamingo is the only access point, I suppose, in the Everglades, where you can really get right out to the edge of the Gulf. And so you can typically see crocodiles out there in the open at that point. So crocodiles have an affinity for salt water. They have these lingual salt glands that allow them to live in brackish water, in water that has a much higher salt concentration than alligators are able to survive in. They breed in the fall and early winter, and they leave the mother after 5 weeks. And their range extends into Cuba, all throughout Central America, down into South America. But in the United States, we've just got them there on the very southern tip of Florida, and they're certainly interesting organisms.